This video is going to be an SOL review for Standard 6 of the USVA History Curriculum for the state of Virginia. The standard reads, the student will demonstrate knowledge of the major events from the last decade of the 18th century through the first half of the 19th century by explaining the principles and issues that prompted Thomas Jefferson to organize the first opposition political party, identifying the economic, political, and geographic factors that led to territorial expansion and its impact on the American Indians, examining the reasons why James Madison asked Congress to declare war on Great Britain in 1812 and how this divided the nation, relating the changing character of the American political life in the age of the common man, otherwise known as the Jacksonian era, to increasing popular participating in state and national politics, and lastly, describing the cultural, economic, and political issues that divided the nation, including tariffs, slavery, the abolitionist and women's suffrage movements, and the role of the states in the Union. Essential understandings of this standard include different views of economic and foreign policy issues led to the development of the first American political parties. Economic and strategic interests supported by popular beliefs led to the territorial expansion to the Pacific Ocean. The new American Republican prior to the Civil War experienced dramatic territorial expansion, immigration, economic growth, and industrialization. Americans, stirred by their hunger for land and the ideology of manifest destiny, flocked to new frontiers. And lastly, conflicts between American settlers and Indian nations in the Southeast and the Old Northwest resulted in the relocation of many Indians to reservations. Other essential understandings for the standard include regional self-interest led to a divided nation at war against the British, an extension of the franchise, westward expansion, and the rise of sectional interest prompted increased participation in state and national politics. The nation struggled to resolve sectional issues, producing a series of crises and compromises. Additionally, the crises took place over the admission of new states to the Union during the decades before the Civil War. The issue was whether the number of free states and slave states would remain balanced, thus affecting the distribution of power in Congress. Essential questions that you should ask yourself while watching this video include, why did competing political parties develop during the 1790s? What factors influenced American westward movement? What were the causes of the War of 1812? In what ways did political democracy change in the years following the War of 1812? And lastly, what issues divided America in the first half of the 19th century? Alright, let's start this off. So first we have George Washington, who is pretty much unanimously decided as the first president of the United States, and he's going to be president between 1789 and 1797. So why is he so important? The big thing is that being the first president, George Washington is going to have the ability to set what are known as precedents. So the president is going to be setting precedents. And what that basically means is how to do things, right? So some of the precedents that George Washington sets in particular are the establishment of a cabinet. So you have a number of people that are underneath George Washington in the executive branch, people like the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of Treasury, who will be essentially in charge of those different areas. And these people are really important to the government. They make things go. The president just can't be everywhere at once, and by having these men underneath him that he respects and appreciates their opinion, being able to kind of act relatively autonomously to control these different sections of the government, it's just a little easier for the president to not have to manage all of it at once. So another precedent that President Washington sets is this whole idea that if the government, if people want to change the government, they're going to have to do this legitimately. And the way he is able to do this is with the basically putting down what's known as the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion is this situation that's going on in western Pennsylvania when the government and Alexander Hamilton pass what is known as the whiskey tax as part of an economic plan. And the farmers out west are really upset by this, and they let people know it, right? And they start rebelling. So this is kind of just situationally, it's exactly what was going on with the Shays Rebellion, if you remember, or pretty close to it anyway. And now the big thing is that the government has the power to handle this, and that is very important here, because when President Washington sends Alexander Hamilton to squash this Whiskey Rebellion, essentially what that's saying is that if these people now want change, they can't just form a mob and get angry and start breaking things and shooting people and things like that, that they're going to need to do this legitimately through the representation that they've been afforded in Congress. Another big thing that George Washington is going to be known for is his dedication to neutrality. The United States was a very new country at this time, and frankly, George Washington did not want to get involved in foreign entanglements. He didn't want to have alliances with other countries, and he didn't want to get led into wars on behalf of these other countries, right? And as a result, he's going to remain neutral when we have the French start having issues with the French Revolution and heading to war with Great Britain as well, and then also with issues of British impressment, which is British basically taking control of American vessels on the high seas and taking a number of their people, the sailors, into the service of the British Navy, which is going to also lead to the passing of what's known as the Jay's Treaty. So another precedent that George Washington is going to set is this whole idea that a president will only serve 2 terms, right? There's nowhere in the Constitution that, at this point in time anyway, that says that a president can only serve 2 terms. But when George Washington decides to step down after 2 terms, well, this is a really big deal. And when it comes down to it, almost every other president going forward is going to follow this and only serve 2 terms as well. So George Washington, at the end of his presidency, is going to give this one last famous farewell address. And in this farewell address, he's going to warn of the dividing nature of factions and political parties and warn of foreign entanglements and things like that going forward. Naturally, now we are going to begin to get our political parties, which is exactly what George Washington was kind of arguing against. And the big 2 are going to be known as the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And here you have the Federalists. And the big 2 people, anyway, for the Federalists that are kind of in charge of them and running them, and some of the biggest names anyway. You have John Adams, who is going to be the next president, and then you also have a man named Alexander Hamilton. And the big thing about the Federalists, their beliefs is really that they kind of believe in that stronger national government. These are people that had kind of really advocated for the Constitution and the creation of a Constitution. And when it comes down to it, they really say that the government has implied powers by the Constitution. Things don't necessarily need to be explicitly stated, and if there is an end in the Constitution, in what the way the wording is said, that basically everything to get to that end is essentially implied, and this is really a loose interpretation of the Constitution and leads to a kind of a bit of a stronger government. Another thing that the Federalists kind of believe in is this whole idea of a commercial economy. These people are more involved with the commerce and the trading between nations and the different markets and things like that. And it's kind of a step away from the agricultural-based economy that much of America is at this point, and which is what the opposing Jeffersonian Republicans are going to be advocating for. They also very much support the First National Bank as a means of kind of providing this enterprise and the ability for the government and people to get loans and things like that to start up this enterprise and commercial activity we were just talking about. And as a result, right, these people are going to sometimes be seen as the kind of snobs, the rich people, the rich snobs, and they are supported by the bankers and major business interests in the Northeast. And the last piece of this is they are considered Anglophiles, and what that means is that they are looking for good relationships with Great Britain, and that's why they're advocating for things like passing of the Jay's Treaty and things like that to keep relationships with Great Britain good so that they can maintain trade relations and make more money and things like that. So the opposite side of the coin, you have the Democratic Republicans, who are mostly led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they are, as I said, opposites, right? They believe in a much weaker national government. They believe that the states should have a lot of that power, and when it comes down to it, they really are looking for a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Basically, the government cannot act in ways that the Constitution does not explicitly state. Additionally, what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are looking for and arguing about is this having the economy of the United States based on agriculture, right? The whole hope is that the individual will be able to have a farm and sustain themselves and have land, and they won't even need the government because they're self-sustaining. they are going to oppose Jay's treaty with Britain, and these Democratic Republicans are going to be supported a lot by many of the farmers, in particular in the South and the expanding West, other artisans and traders, and the frontier settlers moving on in the South. And due to Thomas Jefferson's proximity as an ambassador to France, and just in general, the Democratic Republicans are much more in line with France, and are considered Francophiles, and they believe in relationships with France and honoring treaties that we have with France. So we have John Adams now win the presidency in 1796, and he's going to inherit a number of the issues that were left by the Washington presidency, right? With the passing of the Jay's Treaty, what's going to happen is the French are going to be angered by this, especially because the French were a major ally for the Americans in the American Revolution, and they kind of see this as being stabbed in the back. So just as the British were impressing American ships and attacking American shipping, the French are going to kind of start doing this now when the British stop as a result of the Jay's Treaty. So the Americans can't really catch a break here. And as a hope of trying to kind of stop this issue, John Adams is going to send 3 ministers over to France to negotiate with the French foreign minister. And when they get there and they go to talk to this French foreign minister named Talleyrand, they are actually met by 3 agents of him. And these people actually demand a bribe and a loan, and if there was any hope for the Americans to actually negotiate and meet with Talleyrand. So the Americans are very upset by this, and they return really angered. And what's going to happen is, because of that anger, the Americans, many people are going to be calling for war with France. The Democratic Republicans are really going to hope that this war doesn't happen, but the Federalists are really, really pushing it, especially as a result of the way that the American ministers were treated in France. So John Adams is actually going to do very well here. One of the things he's going to do is he's actually going to build a stronger navy. He's going to build a number of ships, and he's going to kind of start doing exactly what the French were doing to us back at them. And he's going to start seizing a number of French ships in retaliation. And what's going to happen is we're going to get what's known as this quasi-war, where we have this kind of fighting that's going on the high seas. You have these people kind of seizing each other's ships, but we never actually end up in a full-scale war where our militaries are going to be involved. So with the positive that comes out of President Adams' handling of the quasi-war, you're going to have some other issues that are going to kind of mar his presidency and not look very good with the passing of what's known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Alien and Sedition Acts are going to be passed, and frankly, those are what's going to kind of lead to President Adams only being a one-term president, with Thomas Jefferson next up. So after a tie in the Electoral College in 1800 between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, the tie is going to be broken in the House of Representatives and going toward Thomas Jefferson. It's going to start Aaron Burr on the long saga of having a duel with Alexander Hamilton, where he actually kills Alexander Hamilton, and the saga continues quite a bit. It's very interesting, and if I suggest, if you're interested at all, to look it up. But anyway, moving on. So the reason why the election of 1800 is going to be so important is because this is the first American presidential election in which power is going to be peacefully transferred from one political party to another, right? This is huge. This shows that the system works and that this can continue and things are good, right? Because if the Federalists who were in power decided they didn't want to give up the power, then we were going to have a serious problem. So the fact that this happens peacefully is really positive, and it's set the precedent that this continues to happen until this today. So some of the big things that Thomas Jefferson is known for as president is first authorizing the Louisiana Purchase, and he's going to buy the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte in France in 1803. And this is really important because pretty much overnight what's going to happen is the size of the United States is going to double. And you can see it on this map here. The purple section in the middle is the Louisiana Territory, and it's huge. And the funny thing is this is kind of contradictory to Jefferson's beliefs, right? He is the person that's advocating for kind of this strict interpretation of the Constitution, and nowhere in the Constitution basically said that he could do this. But it was a great opportunity. It basically bought a ton more land for him to push the idea of agriculture and the farms and individual farms and homesteads and things like that in the West, and the spread of his Jeffersonian Republicanism. So with this new land now, he's going to authorize also this Lewis and Clark expedition. And the Lewis and Clark expedition, which is set on this map, and you can see the black line, is going to be this couple-year journey by these men and their men, and they're going to explore the new territory. And it's going to be this mapping and scientific endeavor where they're going to talk to all these different Native American groups, some hostile, some not, befriend them, and basically figure out what's out there, right? And they're going to use this young woman whose name is Sacagawea, and she's going to serve as a translator for the journey and guide, and it's really this pretty incredible journey. After Thomas Jefferson, you're going to get President James Madison, and James Madison is president from 1809 to 1817, and the big things that go on during his presidency really is that you're going to have this continuing tension between Great Britain and America. So the British are going to be provoking Native Americans in the West to attack settlers that are now moving into the Northwest Territory. And you're going to have this confederation of Native Americans under a man named Tecumseh, who is going to ally itself with Great Britain. And the way they see it is to kind of be their last-ditch effort, more or less, to kind of stifle this American expansion west, the Native Americans anyway, the way they see it. And in addition to that provocation, the British are also continuing the impressment of the American ships and shipping on the high seas, and this is a major problem and thorn in the side for Americans as well. So you are going to get this situation where the Democratic Republicans are pushing for war for Great Britain. The Federalists are opposed to this. They don't want to fight a war, and you're going to get a declaration of war by James Madison anyway. And the Federalists are going to be very upset about this. In fact, there's going to be talk of secession and even chances at constitutional amendments to kind of stop this. But when it comes down to it, none of this was actually acted upon, and we are going to get war. And the Democratic Republicans are going to be known as war hawks for pushing this war. The thought, for the Federalists anyway, is that they want to take land up in Canada to basically continue this expansion of Jeffersonian republicanism on the frontier. So we get the War of 1812, and in the early stages of the war, they're going to be in the Northwest Territory, really against the British and Tecumseh and his confederation. You're going to have this major naval battle in Lake Erie by a man named Oliver Hazard Perry, who is an American, and other maneuvers and things like that, where you're going to actually have America kind of winning up in the Northwest. But then with the defeat of Napoleon in 1814, what's going to happen is now Britain is going to have a lot more resources to kind of throw at this war, and you're going to kind of get a prioritization of the war in North America, and you're going to get the British fleet showing up on the East Coast and the British Army, and they're going to march on Washington, D.C., where they're going to actually set fire to the White House and the Capitol building, and if it wasn't for a major storm that kind of blew in that night, we might have lost these buildings forever. The American military had pulled out at Washington, D.C., and they had kind of gone up to Baltimore, where you're going to get this very famous battle at Fort McHenry, in Baltimore. It's going to repel this British attack, which is going to be huge, and this is where we're actually going to get the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key was out on a ship in the harbor overlooking this, and he writes the national anthem not long after, inspired by this. As the war drags on, what's going to happen is, again, the British are going to lose popular support for the war. They're also going to kind of lose a situation up in northern New York, and between that and the loss in Baltimore, people in Britain are just going to not want to pay for this anymore, and we do get to negotiate a treaty with the Americans, and the treaty is known as the Treaty of Ghent. And more or less what this does is it restores the borders to lines drawn before the war, and it's also going to solidify American control over the Oregon Territory, which had basically been, if you remember, searched and discovered by the Lewis and Clark expedition. So, funny thing is we're actually going to have a battle now fought after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, and this battle is going to be the Battle of New Orleans, due to this slow communication, and this is going to be American, led by the man named Andrew Jackson, who will end up being a president, and when we win here, what this does is it officially solidifies United States' claim to the Mississippi River and the Louisiana Territory, because the British had frankly not recognized the sale by France to America because they felt they had claim to it. So after this also, you're going to get American settlers beginning to expand and migrate into Florida, even though it was more or less Spanish territory at this time. But we're going to be getting a treaty with Spain not much after this that's going to get Florida from them as well. So now, with things kind of having gone well at the end of this war, with the Federalists who had been against the war and been anti-war, they're going to lose a lot of their popular support, and the party is going to more or less disappear. It's going to leave the Democratic Republicans as more or less the sole powerful political party in the United States after the War of 1812. So now, with the Democratic Republicans more or less being the sole powerful party, you're going to have President James Monroe elected in 1816 and be the president between 1817 and 1825. The era during his presidency is going to become known as the era of good feelings for a couple of different reasons, and one of the big ones is this expansion of Jeffersonian republicanism, right? So what's going to happen is you're going to start to get new technologies like canals, which is basically digging this huge water system between bigger bodies of water, and this is going to allow the shipping and the movement of boats from places that would never have been able to before the advent of canals. You're going to have finally the creation of the steam engine, which is going to lead to a locomotive for trains eventually, but also at this time you're going to have steamboats on these large rivers, which is going to be able to now move much of these goods from the center of the country out, and then also you're going to be getting much better road systems being created as well. And what these technologies now are going to be able to do is it's going to allow these individuals to have farms far away from the markets, which are more or less situated at the coasts, right? And the creation of canals and steam engines and steamboats and all of these things is going to drastically decrease the price of shipping, which is going to allow these things to happen, right? And this is going to lead to what's known as the market revolution, where you're going to have this enterprise and this spreading of business and thought and things like that, to all over the country, right? And you're going to kind of have, it's kind of funny because Monroe is about spreading this individual farming, but these technologies and the push is going to actually lead to kind of a lot more of a capitalistic and enterprise and mindset across the country. One of the major things about President Monroe and his presidency is going to be passing of what's called the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And what's going on is you have this major expansion of independence movements in Latin America and in South America, and Americans are going to see the Western Hemisphere, nations in particular, as inherently different from Europe, right? You have republics versus kingdoms, and when it comes down to it, what this doctrine says is that America will regard as a threat to her own safety any threat to impose the European systems on any independent state in the Western Hemisphere, right? So just to kind of bullet point it and sum it up, Europe is not able to interfere with current independent states or territories in America, and also Europe can't create new territories in America. Otherwise, America will consider this potentially as an act of war, right? And to really sum it up, the U.S. basically will stay out of European affairs. We will not get involved in anything going on in Europe, right, if Europe stays out of America's affairs in the Western Hemisphere. And this is a great cartoon. Just take a pause and take a look at it and read the language and kind of see what's going on up there. Also at this time, you have what's known as the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. And what's going to happen is that as we start to get west, right, you're going to have more and more people heading out there and more areas and territories essentially meeting the requirements to become states, right? And at this point, Missouri is at that point, and Missouri is going to apply for statehood. And this is a big deal at the time period because at that point, you have an equal number of free states and slave states at 11, right? And the admission of any new state is going to upset the balance in Congress, and in particular in the Senate. So that's a huge deal. So what happens is we ultimately get a compromise, and the compromise is going to now lead to 2 new states. So they say that Missouri can come into the Union as a slave state as long as Maine also comes in as a free state. So we maintain that balance in Congress, in the Senate, and what they do also is they set this line, this line that you can see there in green at 36 degrees and 30 minutes north latitude. And what it essentially does is draws a line through the Louisiana Purchase, and they're trying to settle the issue of slavery once and for all, right? Everything above this line moving forward will be free in the territories, and anything below this line will have slaves. The South was mostly okay with this because at this point, what's going to happen is they're starting to eye that land in Texas and in the Southwest that currently is under control of Mexico. That they're eyeing this land, and frankly, they want it, and that going forward, that the hope is that to have that, and that will end up being slavery states. So after James Monroe, you are now going to have a new presidential election between 2 men, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, in 1824. And so after something called the corrupt bargain, where John Quincy Adams uses his friendship with a member in the House of Representatives to basically win an electoral college tie, he becomes president, and you're going to have 4 years of John Quincy Adams. But Andrew Jackson is not going to be deterred. He's going to run again in 1828, and it's going to be a very different ball game. The reason why it's going to be so different is that between 1824 and 1828, you're going to have this massive expansion of who can actually vote. So in 1828, in the election, what's going to happen is that you no longer need land to vote, right? You no longer need to own land, and that is huge. What the whole hope is that is looking to kind of create an equality and heightened participation amongst all adult white males, right? This equality is just for white males at this point, right? Women aren't voting, and slaves and other African Americans are not voting at this point. But if you are a white male, the good news is that you can finally vote, even if you don't own land, right? And this is big for all of the wage earners and things like that are now in the Northeast after all of the enterprise and all of the market revolution that we just talked about, right? So take a look at this graph real quick. At 1824, you have about 28% roughly of people voting in this election, and then in 1828 you are close to 60%, right? So you're almost doubling the amount of people that can vote, and that is huge because now what's going to happen is you're going to have this kind of changing of style of campaigning, right? You're going to have candidates now campaigning to all of these people, trying to get them interested, trying to get them emotionally involved in the candidacy to get out and vote, right? This is called populism. And Andrew Jackson is the definition of a populist president. He's appealing to emotions to get these people to vote. And you're also going to get this increased sectionalism and the rise of interest group politics going on at the same time. Andrew Jackson is going to personify the democratic spirit of the age, right? You're going to have this massive increase of democracy, whereas the country was founded as a republic, right? Everyone couldn't vote. The whole hope, I guess, was that you have smart, educated people making the decisions, right? But at this point now, we're having a lot more people being able to vote. And as a result, Andrew Jackson is going to be a candidate of the people. He is a lot closer to your average person than John Quincy Adams, who is the son of a president, who these people, these farmers in the West and, in the South, these people see John Quincy Adams and they see a snob. Right? They see this rich elite person who is well connected, who's had a much better life than them, and that's one of the reasons why they vote for Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is going to challenge this economic elite we just talked about, and he's going to wage war on the Bank of the United States. He's going to veto the charter and not allow it to basically continue its existence. He's also going to implement what becomes known as the spoils system, where he awards campaign supporters with public office appointments. So basically, if you supported Andrew Jackson for his presidency, he could appoint you in situations, even if you're not necessarily qualified for it, because he didn't actually feel that you needed to have these qualifications. You could learn the job. The average person could do most of these positions of the government. And another thing that Andrew Jackson is also known for is his removal of the Native Americans and pushing Native Americans westward in the name of Manifest Destiny and the establishment of what becomes known as the Trail of Tears, where you're going to have Andrew Jackson pushing several of the eastern tribes and the 5 civilized tribes in the east to places like Oklahoma, away from their ancestral lands. The big one in particular being the Cherokee Nation, whom Andrew Jackson actually ignores a Supreme Court order and passes the Indian Removal Act and forces them out and marches them across hundreds of miles in what's known as the Trail of Tears. Also, during the Jackson administration and the Jackson presidency, you're going to have this upset and debate over tariffs. So in 1828, Congress is going to pass a high tariff on manufactured goods from Europe. And there's going to be 2 camps in this debate, right? The Northerners are going to favor these high protective tariffs really to protect from foreign competition, right? They love it because the Northeast is high in manufacturing, and if the goods from foreign countries now are more expensive, then they're going to be able to make more money as a result. So on the opposite side of that coin, you have the Southerners, who are mostly agricultural. There's very little manufacturing in the South, and therefore they're going to oppose these high tariffs because imports become more expensive. They hate it so much. They call it the tariff of abominations. They say, and it's going to lead to higher prices across the board on manufactured goods because there's not much competition anymore, and therefore the prices are going to get jacked up. So you have John C. Calhoun, who is actually Andrew Jackson's vice president from South Carolina, who is arguing that the states have the right to nullify laws that are against their own interests. And his argument, and the South's argument here, is that since the federal government is a creation of the states are then the final authority of the constitutionality of federal laws. And as a result of these opinions, you're going to get what is known as the Nullification Crisis. And Andrew Jackson actually is going to side with the Union on nullification and not the South. The South, was angry over these tariffs and it continued to build. In fact, so much so that the South is threatening secession, and that the thought that the Union could actually split over this. So the North actually passes a lower tariff, attempting to ease the tension, but the South, and South Carolina in particular, passes the Nullification Act, which declares that it's not going to pay any of the illegal tariffs of 1828 or 1832. So what Andrew Jackson does, and one of the big things why he becomes famous, is known as this force bill. He actually passes a bill and allows a bill to be passed that allows the president to use force to enforce acts of Congress. And this is huge because Andrew Jackson then threatens to send troops to collect these tariff revenues in the South if necessary. And that's going to be really big, and Andrew Jackson is going to get a nickname, actually, as a result of everything we just talked about, as King Andrew, because of his use of the veto, and also for his actions here as well. With the expansion westward now, that question comes down to, are these areas going to be slave or not, right? And one of the big reasons why this is such a big deal and such a big question is with the invention of the cotton gin. You have this man named Eli Whitney who invents this, and it's going to really make it so much quicker to harvest cotton. And that's a really big deal because the whole hope of Eli Whitney when he created it was actually that they would need less slaves. But now all of a sudden, with so much more production, it basically is going to lead to an increased spread of slavery even more, and this whole cotton kingdom in the deep South, which is going to be agriculturally based around this cotton. You're going to get this increased demand, and when it comes down to it, this is going to really influence the Southern economy to remain plantation and agricultural based, instead of going the industrial way that the North is. at the time period, you also have this whole idea of manifest destiny come to be. And what that really means is that manifest destiny means it is God-given right to the United States to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and this thought is going to allow political support and provide political support for territorial expansion no matter what is in the way. And sadly, the Native Americans that are in these areas are going to be repeatedly defeated in violent conflicts with settlers and soldiers, and often forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands, and they are going to then typically be confined to reservations, right? And you can see in this picture here, you have basically Lady Liberty, angelic like, leading the charge westward. You can see the train behind them, right, dropping telegraph lines, and Native Americans in Buffalo more or less running from the forward march of progress of America. And one of these areas where you have this conflict as a result of westward expansion is going to be in Texas. American migration into Texas is going to lead to an armed revolt against Mexican rule in Texas. And during this revolt, you're going to get this very famous battle at what's known as the Alamo. And at the Alamo, you're going to have a band of Texans that are going to fight to the last man against a vastly superior and vastly larger Mexican force, right? And while they lose at the Alamo, Texans are actually going to end up winning this scuffle and this little fight here, and this battle and the war, and the Texans are going to actually get their independence from Mexico, and then subsequently a couple of years later be brought into the United States. And if you see there in the middle in red, where it says disputed between Mexico and Texas, what's going to happen now is you're going to have more of the United States kind of eyeing this land, and American politicians eyeing this land in a fight with Mexico to take it. And this leads to what is known as the Mexican-American War. And the Americans are going to win this during the 1840s, and it's going to lead to the acquisition of an enormous amount of territory. All that territory, that light territory down there, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, parts of Colorado, Nevada, and California, are going to be taken from Mexico after this war and this winning by the United States. So taking a step back a little bit here, in opposition now to the Democratic Party led by Andrew Jackson and such, you're going to have kind of two new political parties that get established because, if you remember, the Federalist Party had more or less disappeared, right? And the big one here are going to be known as the Whigs, and the Whigs are going to favor industrialization, and they're actually going to question expansionism for the sake of expansion, right? In fact, the Whigs are going to be impressive because they're actually going to get two presidents over the course of two decades. And the party's going to fall apart due to kind of some internal conflict over the expansion of slavery. But the two presidents that are Whigs are actually William Henry Harrison, who's actually going to die a month into office from pneumonia because he gave such a long speech at his inauguration, but also a man named Zachary Taylor, who is a war hero from the Mexican-American War. And lastly, the other party that you should know about is these Know-Nothings, and they are an American nativist party. They are largely Protestant. They don't like Catholics. They are opposed to immigration as a whole. And at first they kind of start as this secret society where they would say, right, they know nothing, which is where they get their name, and it's going to transition into what is known as the American Party. And these two are going to be relatively important factors during this time period. So that now takes us to the Compromise of 1850, right? What are we going to now do with this land from the Mexican-American War, right? And really, the thought would be that that should be settled after the Missouri Compromise, but now we're going to kind of get a couple different things to kind of change all of that up, right? So you have this new compromise, and it's called the Compromise of 1850, and what it does is basically that California, as you can see all the way there in the west, is going to now enter as a free state, and what this then says is that the new southwestern territories that are going to be acquired from the Mexican-American War first, they're going to be able to decide slavery through what's known as popular sovereignty, right? And that the Utah and New Mexico territories are going to be able to do this, and other states are as well. So it kind of throws away now this Missouri Compromise line that we had just established 30 years before. And throwing away that line and leaving it towards popular sovereignty is going to lead to some other major issues in this increased sectionalism and violence that's going to now be happening in this lead up to the Civil War. So with the repeal of that Missouri Compromise line, you're basically giving other areas, in particular in Kansas and Nebraska, the choice of whether to allow slavery in their states through this popular sovereignty, right? So they get to choose. That's the whole idea. That's what popular sovereignty means. And it's going to produce this bloody fighting in Kansas. You're going to have a situation where you actually have a man named Preston Brooks who attacks a member of Congress on the Congress floor, and he beats him bloody with this cane, right? It's a really, really big deal. And you're going to get this other fighting that's going on in Kansas. You're going to have people that are entering these states, in particular, just to vote for whether or not they would be slave states or free states. And it's going to lead to all sorts of issues. And the Kansas Nebraska Act is going to lead to the birth of the Republican Party the same year to oppose slavery. So now you're going to get the Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854 as one of these new events and other events that's going to kind of help pave the way and lead the way for the Civil War. And it's going to be ugly, right? So now this is going to repeal the Missouri Compromise line, right, by giving these people in Kansas and Nebraska the choice of whether to allow slavery in their states or not through this whole idea of popular sovereignty, which basically means they're just going to vote, right? And this is going to produce some bloody fighting in Kansas as you're going to get these pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces that get in Kansas and fight one another. You're going to have people that are entering these states specifically to vote, even though they don't plan to live there or had lived there. And it's going to cause a whole lot of problems. You're going to get these people known as border ruffians that are roughing up people as they walk, come across into these states, right? And in fact, it's going to get so ugly that a member of Congress, a man named Preston Brooks, is actually going to get beat on the floor of Congress by another man with a cane, beat bloody essentially because of his opinions on slavery or not. So this is also going to lead to the birth of the Republican Party the same year as a means of opposing slavery. Elsewhere, you are going to have some serious tensions from slavery that are created that are going to help lead to the Civil War and all the events that lead up to it, right? So in Virginia in particular, you're going to have a couple of different slave revolts. So you're going to have this man named Gabriel Prosser, who in 1800 is going to plan a rebellion, but it's never going to get to that point when he's found out, but he's going to be executed as a result. And then you are also going to have another man named Nat Turner, who is actually going to be able to get a number of his friends and get out, basically have a bit of a rebellion, killing a number of whites, and this is majorly problematic. And these two instances in particular are going to help feed the Southerners' fears over slave rebellions. And what this is going to then do, and what they are going to do to kind of try to stop it, is it's going to lead to the passing of harsh slave codes, which are basically ways of limiting slave rights and things like that, trying to not let them meet with each other and things as a means of trying to not allow rebellions to happen. It's also going to help pass fugitive slave laws. So any slaves that are actually able to escape and get north, the thought is that these are property, right? These people are property as slaves, and the North is meant and obligated to actually help catch these slaves and return them to their owners, right? And fugitive slave events are going to basically put the Southern slave owners against outraged Northerners who are going to be more and more in favor of not having slavery. The Northerners are then going to be opposed more or less to returning these escaped slaves to bondage as a result of these fugitive slave laws. you are going to have the abolitionist movement that begins in the North, right? And it's going to be led by a man named William Lloyd Garrison in particular here, who is known and famous for publishing an abolitionist newspaper known as The Liberator. You also have another newspaper known as the North Star that is published by Frederick Douglass. And what this is going to do is these increasingly view the institution of slavery as a violation of Christian principles and are going to argue for the abolition, so getting rid of slavery completely, right? And Southerners are going to grow alarmed by the growing force of Northern response, of abolitionists, and as a result, you're also going to get Southerners who actually favor abolition, but they're going to be intimidated into silence by the increasingly more and more irate Southerners at the thought of abolitionism and talks of abolition in the nation. And the last part of the standard talks about another major reform movement that is kind of starting to get legs at this time period in the women's suffrage movement, right? So at this same time, the movement to give women equal rights is being led by a couple women, really, but the two that you really need to know here are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a woman named Susan B. Anthony. They are involved in this suffrage movement and give it legs prior to the Civil War. You're going to have this famous Seneca Falls Declaration in 1848 where they are declaring themselves equal to men, and it's going to be signed by many prominent women and even some men as well. And the movement's going to gain tons of momentum prior to the Civil War, but it's going to only pick up even more steam after the Civil War and continue until obviously women get similar rights as men. So that is it for Standard 6. I hope you enjoyed and you continue listening to my next one.